Chapter 20. Owen heard a car honk but could see nothing except street lights and the sides of buildings from the back seat. He could tell the car was speeding, and Michael and the blonde stranger were in the front seats, but he had no idea where they were going. He was still weak from the pool fight. "Where are we going to do this?" he heard Michael ask. "There," the stranger said. Owen assumed the guy was pointing at something, but he couldn't see where. Suddenly, the car made a sharp right. Owen was pushed back against the seat, as if the car were going uphill. He looked up through the window and saw a low concrete ceiling and a lot of columns. This had to be the 6th-level parking garage that was a few blocks from the condo. Suddenly, the car stopped and the driver's side window lowered. "Jason, what are you doing?" Michael asked. "Getting a ticket to park," Jason replied. "It's free. There's no point in making a scene. It could make things difficult for us. If we're interrupted, we might not finish at all." The car was in motion again. Owen could hear voices in the distance. He wanted to scream for help, but he knew whoever it was would be no match for Michael, and Owen didn't want to get innocent people killed. He decided to keep his mouth shut, and, once his strength was back, he'd take Michael and Jason out himself. Chris jogged down Calhoun Street, looking left and right. He patted his hoodie pocket for a reassurance. They were there, all right. Suddenly, he stopped at the corner of Calhoun and 3rd Street. He had caught a glimpse of something silver driving up through the parking garage in front of him. It was the Jetta. He crossed the street and ran up the nearest stairwell of the garage, heart racing with every second that ticked by. He knew what he was going to do when he got up there, but he was afraid of how things would turn out. For him and for Owen. Owen felt the car pull into a slow stop. Jason got out as Michael looked back at Owen from the passenger seat. "It's showtime," said the redhead. Owen was pulled forcefully from the back seat. Michael carried him, feet off the ground, toward Jason. Jason saw them and an angry expression grew on his face. "Put him down, damn it!" he spat. "We don't want to look suspicious. Not now." With a sigh, Michael set Owen firmly on the ground. Owen looked around. They were on the top level of the garage. There were only a few cars parked around, and there were no people present. The moon was shining brightly upon the three of them. The stars were more visible than Owen remembered them ever being before. Maybe it was fear making him more aware of things. He didn't know what was about to happen, and it truly frightened him. That was when he noticed Jason carrying a backpack. He set it down on the ground and opened it, placing himself between Owen and the pack. Owen tilted his head, trying to look around Jason to see what was inside, but Michael held him fast. "You'll see what it is in a minute," he whispered in Owen's ear. Jason turned to face them, holding in his hands what looked like a dark red bowling ball. No, it wasn't a bowling ball. It looked familiar to Owen, so very familiar. Jason walked toward him, holding the ball before him, an evil smile on his face. The closer he got, the more Owen grew afraid. It was slowly dawning on him where he'd seen this ball, this orb. His dreams. He had built it himself. Or, at least, he thought he did. "Now," Jason said to Owen, "you're up." Chris frantically searched the 2nd level. He didn't see any Jettas anywhere. There was so much ground to cover, so he ran around with no clear path. He thought of screaming for Owen, but figured a sneak attack was best. He wasn't as strong as Owen, and if Owen was still in Michael's possession, that had to mean something was wrong with him, that he couldn't fight. Chris continued to search for a few more minutes, and then when he was satisfied and frustrated, he made his way to the stairs, up to the 3rd level. "What do you mean?" Owen asked as casually as he could. "I don't know what to do with this." Jason, still holding the dark red orb in front of them, scoffed and shook his head. "You do know what to do," he said, casting an uneasy eye toward Michael. "What do you guys want with it?" Owen asked. "What we want," Jason said, stepping closer and grinning, "is for you to turn this thing on so we can use it. That's all. What makes you think I can get it to work?" "I know you can because I can't," said Michael. "You and I are 2 pieces of a puzzle, my friend. I know you dream about making the orb. I do too. You and I made this thing in a different life." Owen had no idea what to make of this. It was similar to what Nikki had told him. He looked at the orb again. He and Michael had made it? In a different life? Was that true? He only had a vague sense of its purpose. Yet, he could remember vividly how it felt in his hands. Slimy and warm. Evil. That's what it was. Evil. Even though he didn't know exactly what it would do, there was no way he could activate it for them. He wouldn't. "Do you know what it can do?" Owen asked Michael. Michael looked down at him and grinned. "Oh yeah." "Tell me, and maybe I'll do what you want." "How about you tell us or we'll kill you?" "If you kill me, you'll never get that thing to work." Jason lost his grin. "What if I told you it will bring about world peace?" "I would tell you I didn't believe you," Owen replied. "And then I would tell you that you were a fool," Jason said. "Our plan is to end all world wars and bring about a more peaceful existence for everyone, including you." "How is this going to accomplish that?" Jason stepped closer. "Turn it on and find out." Just then, Owen kicked Jason in the stomach, sending him flying against a parked car. His strength was back. But just as he was about to swing around and take down Michael, he felt a sharp pain in the back of his neck. He felt dizzy and dropped to the ground. His vision became extremely blurred, the pain in his neck intense. He looked up and saw Michael lowering his arm after delivering the strike. Then Michael ran over to Jason and helped him to his feet. Jason was groaning and bent double. He looked at something Owen could not see. He walked toward that something, which was blocked by a few parked cars. Owen heard a scream, and then he saw Jason drag a young brunette back to where he lay. Michael grabbed him and held him in place, facing Jason and the girl. Jason pulled out a knife from his pocket and held it to the girl's throat. Owen knew what this was. He knew what Jason was hoping to accomplish by having a hostage. And he hated himself for the decision he had already come to. "Turn it on, Owen," said Jason. Owen looked at the orb on the ground, and then back at Jason and the young girl, who was squirming in his grip. She had to be in her mid-20s. Her black eyeliner began to smear from the tears which started pouring down her face. "Turn it on," Jason said more forcefully. "No." "What?" said Jason. "I'm sorry." Owen was apologizing to the young woman, and for a moment he could see she had understood. Her eyes seemed to be pleading with him more intensely. But he couldn't do it. It was something he and Chris had agreed to. Alyssa and Daniel had refused to accept such a policy. If either one of them were ever in a situation where few could be sacrificed to save many, they would do it. Owen found himself in that very situation now. He shook his head. Jason pressed the knife against the girl's throat, drawing blood. She tried to scream. "What's your name?" Jason asked her. "Hope," she cried out. How fitting. Well, Hope, this guy in front of us has chosen to let you die rather than do something as simple as help us turn on that orb. She looked at the orb between her and Owen. "How does that make you feel?" Jason asked. "Please stop." "I will once he turns it on." "What does it do?" asked Hope. Jason looked taken aback by this. "Does it matter?" "Is it a bomb?" "Far from it." Suddenly, Hope turned and punched Jason right in his crotch. He keeled over in pain. She got up and ran away from the scene. "Run!" Owen screamed. "Get help!" Michael tossed Owen to the ground, grabbed the knife from Jason, and threw it with such force Owen couldn't even see it. He could only hear it piercing the air. What he did see, though, was Hope's head exploding in a shower of red. Her body dropped to the ground. Chris watched the scene with increasing agitation. He felt helpless as Michael and his friend harassed Owen. He watched as they shoved a dark orb in his face. He watched as the stranger grabbed the girl and held a knife to her throat. Then he watched the girl run for her life, only to have her head explode, her body dropping a few feet from him as he hid behind a car. He didn't know what to do. He had concocted a plan that involved blowing these guys to hell with a buster or two, but Owen was too close to them. Chris had to come up with another plan that didn't involve harming his best friend. Then again, he saw how Owen had handled the hostage situation moments earlier, not giving in to his captor's demands for the sake of one person's life. Should Chris do the same? Owen was too tired to move. He lay on his back, looking up at the sky, at the stars twinkling above. "Isn't there something you can do, little brother?" he heard Jason ask desperately. "Well, there is something I've been experimenting with," said Michael. "Do it." Michael appeared over Owen, blocking his view of the sky. He held his hands out in front of him now, placing them on either side of Owen's head. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the most horrible feeling overcame Owen. A terrible rumbling filled his head, literally making his face shiver violently. He felt an immense pressure in his head. It felt like it would explode at any moment. Suddenly, images started appearing in his mind. He saw Daniel, and the silly way he'd fallen out of the treehouse when they had taken out that vampire at the trails. Owen wanted to cry at the sight of it. "He's dead," an unfamiliar voice reminded him. "No more softball." Now he saw the orb being constructed under his delicate hands. His long white fingers touched the surface, first running them around the top, then down the middle, and then finally drawing 3 circles at the base. As he did this, yellow lights appeared where he had touched. When he finished, the orb glowed from within. Instantly, the images in Owen's head vanished as if they were wiped clean from his mind. He could see nothing at all for a moment. His vision had grown to a white blur. "I got it," he heard Michael say, though he sounded as bad as Owen felt. "I know how to do it." "Then do it!" Jason barked. "What's wrong with you?" "Les did something to me earlier. I feel sluggish." With all his strength, Owen turned his head and, with his returning vision, saw Michael pick up the orb and do the same things he'd seen himself doing. First, he circled the top of the orb, then traced his finger down the middle until he got to the base, where he drew 3 circles. Immediately, the orb lit up from within, and the air around Michael became electric. A rumbling was emitting from the orb, and it was getting louder. "Hold it higher," Jason snapped, putting 2 small black earplugs in his ears as he wrapped his arms around his brother to get as close as possible. There were steady blue lights blinking from the plugs, and Owen assumed they were specially made to protect Jason from the orb. Michael held the orb over his head. It looked to Owen as if he were having trouble with it. It was shaking wildly in his grip. Waves were pulsing out of it now, heading in all directions. Whatever this orb was built for, whatever Jason and Michael wanted to accomplish, it was happening now. Chris had seen enough. Now was the time to act. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a buster. He had to blow them away. He didn't like what that strange orb was doing. He knew it was wrong. Owen was still too close to them, though. Owen. He was looking straight at Chris. Chris stared back. The orb was pulsing loudly, too loud for Chris to hear anything around him. It looked as if Owen wanted to speak, but it would have been impossible to hear him. So Owen nodded. What did that mean? Chris asked himself. Owen simply nodded. Then it came to him. Owen was telling him to blow them up right now. Chris nodded back. Now was the time. But he had another idea. He reached into his pocket again. Suddenly, a loud bang that sounded like a thunderclap came from the orb, and the pulse grew in intensity, spreading in all directions. Glass shattered from the nearest buildings, as well as all the glass from the parked cars around them. Car alarms were going off, barely audible due to the pulse. "Now!" Chris thought he heard. He turned back to Owen and saw him screaming at him. Now was definitely the time. Michael and his brother stood close together, directly under the orb, as if trying to stay in a protective circle. Chris pressed down on the activation button of the rejector bomb and threw it at them. The explosion was worse than he imagined it would be. The ground shook, and the explosion itself almost seemed frozen in time. All sound ceased to exist, as if someone had flipped a switch to turn it off. Everything lit up brilliantly. The next moment, time caught up with itself. A powerful force sucked everything inward, toward the orb. Chris grabbed onto the closest car, but it too was being dragged. Then, an explosive force blew everything away. The entire parking garage wobbled and cracked. It felt like it was about to collapse completely. Chris had to get Owen out of there. He ran toward him, trying to stay away from Michael and the orb. He didn't even bother looking at them. He reached Owen, pulling him to his feet. That's when the ground below them gave way. Chris yanked Owen back as the ground collapsed, taking Michael, Jason, and the orb with it. But the crack in the ground spread, and then more ground began to collapse. Cars fell through the expanding hole. Before Chris could even think, Owen lifted him off the ground. The entire garage, all 6 levels of it, was collapsing. Owen ran away from the ever-expanding hole, carrying Chris in his arms. "I can run, you know," Chris screamed. "No time," said Owen. The ground disappeared below Owen's feet. He leapt onto the nearest car, and then the next one after that, as the cars vanished. He continued to leap from car to car, staying off the ground as best he could. The sound of the collapsing structure was overbearing to Chris. How were they going to get out of this? It was only a matter of time before they ran out of space, before the entire building was gone. Owen jumped onto a car that had already begun to fall. Utter fear grasped Chris as the two of them fell, but Owen didn't give up. He jumped to the next car that had started falling above them, and then he jumped to the next one after that. They were going to run out of cars before too long. And that they did. Owen stayed on the last car he jumped to, pinning Chris against the roof so he wouldn't fall away. The car spun and the roof faced down, toward the ground. Owen gripped both sides of the roof and pulled one side with all his strength. The car tilted until the roof faced upward again. Chris took this moment to look around. The entire parking garage was collapsing. All because of one tiny rejector. Chris and Owen looked down as they fell into the void.